Well, welcome to Christ in Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for our discussion today. Today's topic is domestic violence. And I saw a sign when I was out walking. I usually do my prayers when I walk. I walk and I pray. Don't ever try to pray resting or try to pray on the couch. You will fall asleep. You have to get up. You have to do something. You can pray on your knees, and that's helpful because it's hard to fall asleep when you're on your knees. But if you just relax and you start kicking back and you try to pray in that time period, you're going to fall asleep or you're going to get drowsy. But so what I do is I get out of the house, I get walking, I take a long walk, and I pray, and I do my daily prayer time while I walk. And so that's what I've found helpful to me. That might be helpful to you if you try it, if you have a problem doing your prayers every day. But it's a way that I can stay strong, stay spiritual, connected with God in a way. And I break down the prayer time in a number of different segments. I've talked about this before, but I have a praise time, I have a confession time, I have a thanksgiving time, I have a petition time, which means you're asking, you're seeking God, you're helping people by praying for them, interceding for them, and all kinds of things. The nation, pray for the nation, pray for the family, pray for all kinds of things. But during one of my prayer times, I was able to see a sign that struck me as uniquely 21st century. And there's a lot into this sign, and I'll show you some of the signs that I saw as I bring them up here on the computer. Here is what I saw. It was in front of I believe it was a federal building, and it is "Take a Stand Against Domestic Violence." And you see these kinds of signs up all over the place nowadays in the modern era, in the secular world. And then I saw a sign that was also related. It said, "Stop Violence." This was actually, I saw this on the internet. I did not see the sign, but I saw this as I was walking and praying. And it was on actually like a real estate poster. So they stick it up in someone's yard or someone's office, or in this case, it was a federal building. And then you have the different, also other stop domestic violence signs here. Here's another one. Don't turn your back on domestic violence. And then here is a break the silence, end the violence, take a stand against domestic violence. Again, another take a stand. They're trying to tell people to not just go about their business as usual, but to take a stand. October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So you see all kinds of these symbols. And this is the one that caught my attention, and I thought, let me do a video on this because this is something that is really emblematic of our times. What is taking place today in a secular world? As Christians, we have to understand what the secular world is all about. If we don't understand what the secular world is all about, we will be taken in by it. We will be fooled by it. We will be tricked by it, deceived by it. We will buy into it. And so we need to figure out, okay, what's actually happening? Why do we see these ad campaigns? Why do we see these media blitzes for these values now? In a former day, in an older day, and I would say in a wiser day, you wouldn't have media campaigns and commercial blitzes all over the airwaves and social media ads running in the background of your web pages and all kinds of things. You would just simply learn these things through good old-fashioned family values and morality, especially as taught in the Christian church. You would get these truths in the church. You wouldn't need to have a sign strategically placed around society telling people to not hit one another or do violence against one another in the family. You wouldn't have to target people, particularly men in society, and say, hey, don't hit your wives. You wouldn't have to have a media campaign and a blitz and some kind of public relations rollout. You wouldn't have to do that. And why wouldn't you have to do that? Because these values were learned in the church. These values were taught in the families. These values were reinforced in society in a Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview. These are things you just learn by being a part of a Christian culture. But see, what has happened in the last 50 years or so is our Judeo-Christian foundation for moral values has crumbled, and the secular world has rushed in to fill it with all kinds of other values. Now, one of the values that they're trying to promote here is that they're trying to stop men and boyfriends and males of all types from beating or hitting or abusing women, which is something that, like I said, in the former days, you would learn in church, you would learn in your family. These values would be passed on from fathers to sons, mothers to sons, families to the next generation. And you wouldn't need a media campaign. You wouldn't need a social media ad publicity campaign to try to convince people to not do violence in the home. But you do now because of the way secularism has undermined the Christian faith, undermined the church. And we just see this in the COVID lockdowns of 2020, and still here in the next year, lockdowns are still in place in some places where the church is seen as a very non-essential functioning gathering. And so church services on Sunday are banned in some municipalities and so forth. And the church is belittled, it's mocked, its leaders are laughed at and treated as buffoons, and Christian leaders are not held in high esteem. And all of the secular attack on Christianity results in people don't have the benefit of the Judeo-Christian moral value foundation. And so what do you do to try to get people to act the right way? Well, you have to do a massive ad campaign, and you have to roll out all kinds of slogans and cliches and posters and memes, and you have to do all this extra hard work in the social media and mainstream media and running billboards and all kinds of things to get people to understand what's right and wrong. And then hopefully there is a critical mass that's built up to the point maybe 51% of the people or a committed minority even of the people who put sufficient social pressure on people to not do these things that are wrong. Whereas in the past, it wasn't necessary to have this big ad campaign because these were things taught in the church every week, and people attended church every week. They had these reinforced in their life every week. They were taught in Sunday school that you don't hit your mother or your sister or your wife, or you don't do violence in the home, and you learn the teachings of Jesus, turn the other cheek, and forgive instead of lashing out in violence and so forth. So these things are all secular attempts to try to sort of gin up a morality in a immoral culture. And when I see something like this ad campaign to take a stand against violence, domestic violence, I really see this as a failure on the part of society to understand that what is at stake here is really the family. It's not trying to then put Band-Aids on a major problem or a bigger problem. And the big problem is the breakdown of the family and the breakdown of faith and morals in our culture. And so when you think about taking a stand against domestic violence, what would be the biggest thing that people could do in society to take a stand against domestic violence? Well, the biggest thing that they could do would be to get married in the context of a Christian church and in the context of a Christian community that will hold both the man and the woman accountable to their marriage vows. And those marriage vows, those traditional Judeo-Christian marriage vows, are still sound, solid, wise vows that need to be reinforced. And so if you want to take a stand against domestic violence, the biggest thing that couples can do is to get married and to make commitments in front of God in a church and in front of the people in their lives, their family, and their friends in the context of a Christian, Judeo-Christian community, so that loving support will be there, that loving encouragement. If they go through a rough time in their marriage, there can be pastoral counseling. They know a pastor knows them. They feel comfortable in going in to talk to the pastor and getting couples counseling, marriage counseling. It's not this major step that they would have to take, this big, imposing thing that they would have to enter a church or visit a pastor. Some people have been so absent from church for so long that to visit a church and visit a pastor in his office and sit down and talk, this would be a major thing for them. They would feel so awkward. Well, that's because they're not practicing a living faith and they're not participating in a living Christian community. And so if you want to stamp out domestic violence, encourage couples to marry within the context of a Christian faith, a faith community. And we all know the statistics, and it's not just a matter of coming along later and putting Band-Aids on relationships, a couple's relationships. It's a matter of getting the foundation right. Now, we all know the statistics. We all know that today it's very popular for couples who are, quote, in love to just live together, to just casually, they used to call it shacking up, living in sin, if you want to interject the theological and moral implications of what they're doing. And this is a sloppy, disorganized, non-committed relationship where there is lacking in mutual respect, there is lacking in mutual commitment, there is lacking in seriousness, there have been no promises made, there have been no testimonies or covenant entered into in the context of a community where there is a church, you're in a church, you're committing your lives before God and the people and your family and your friends, and that makes it serious and somber, and that puts the context upon which everything else is built. But today, that is not the thing that happens usually. What has happened is a couple will like each other. And then they'll say, hey, I'd like to get you to know you more. Why don't you come in and live with me? And so then they start living together. And then they may even have a child together. And so there's no commitment. There's no eternal promises before a living God. There's no community promises. It's just a casual thing. And then when things go bad, they don't have that community, that faith community that they can draw upon. They don't have the role models of other older couples who are organized spiritually and morally, you might want to put it that way, who have successfully gone through the ups and downs of a marriage. And so there is a disorganized, chaotic mess that these couples have to face. And out of that messed up community, their little shacking up and living in sin situation, that's where domestic violence comes in. And you could go on then and talk about, well, then there are many girls that have 3 or 4 kids that they're raising, and 3 or 4 men who have impregnated them, and these children each have separate fathers. And so when these fathers want to come over and visit one of their children, then the other kids don't know how to act because this is not their dad. and some of the other fathers might get jealous of some of the other men traipsing in and out of the home. And it's just a mess. It's a disorganized, chaotic mess. And out of that disorganization and casual, sloppy relationship foundations, that's where the domestic violence comes in. So it's not enough to put up posters and say, stop domestic violence, take a stand. We have to take a stand against this. Why don't we do something more important than take a stand? Why don't we do relationships right from the beginning? Why don't we get married right from the beginning? Why don't we have weddings and marriages in a church context right from the beginning? Why don't we get to know the pastor and the spiritual leaders of the church so that when there are trouble, we can take advantage of the resources that God has provided in the church? Why don't we go to couples classes, premarital counseling classes at the church, where you maybe will read a book or study the basic foundations of what a marriage is with other couples that are thinking about marriage? They're maybe newlyweds, or they could be engaged, and they can go through a good, healthy book, maybe by someone like a James Dobson or a well-known Christian authority on marriage and family, and get good information. A lot of the domestic violence is due to a lot of ignorance in the community in which people are being raised in. And it makes sense. If you're raised in a ghetto where 3/4 to 80%, almost even up to 100% in some communities, if you're raised in that environment where the men and the women are just living together and casually, and then the man will move out, and then the kids will be raised by this single parent mother who's on welfare, and she's getting government aid for this and that and food stamps. She's living in poverty, and men are coming in and then they're going out, and she's raising 2, 3, 4 kids by 2, 3, 4 separate men. And again, they're intermingling and connecting, and then she's dating someone totally different. And these men come and go left and right. It is a mess. And no wonder there is domestic violence. So it's not enough to just say, hey, let's stop domestic violence. Let's stop it. Yeah, stop domestic violence, but let's do the things that you have to do to prevent this from even coming up. And that is, you have to build healthy, strong, faith-filled marriages where you have at least a chance of surviving. Now, that doesn't mean that Christian marriages are just the model of perfection in society. We know that the world and the secular and the immorality in our world has affected even Christian marriages. It's a sad situation where the light of the world, Christians are supposed to be the light of the world. Jesus says, let your light shine before men so that they see and glorify God. Well, a lot of Christian marriages are following the disorganized, chaotic mess of the secular world instead of standing on the truths of God and living according to the will of God. They're following along in that mess. And a lot of Christian marriages are just as chaotic and disorganized as any of the secular marriages are. And it's because they're copying the errors and the foolishness that they see in the movies and the television and all kinds of different influences that we have in our secular world. But the answer is not to just simply run an ad campaign and say, stop domestic violence. You have to go deeper than that. You have to go at a higher standard than that. And you have to say, look, let's get to the root of this problem. Let's stop trying to patch up a broken situation. Let's not get broken in the first place. Let's keep marriages on a firm foundation so we don't have to come back after the disaster happens and try to step in and tell people, hey, stop domestic violence. Well, yeah, how do you do that? Well, the best way to do it, again, I'll repeat it again, marry the father of your children. If you're a woman, if you want to increase the chances that you will never be abused, physically abused, or you want to stop the chances of domestic violence in your household, marry the father of your children. Don't have children with someone you're not married to. This is such a basic, simple truth. But if women would follow this and would require that the man that fathers their children be also their husband, and that they be married, and that you have the marriage first and then the children. Don't have the children first and then think about, well, someday we're going to get married. Because a lot of times, again, that's a sloppy, casual, blasé kind of, well, maybe, maybe not. No, get it clear in your head and learn from the Bible and learn from Christianity that there is a proper order to life. If you want an ordered life, and let's be honest, domestic violence is a result of disorder. It's a result of chaos. It's a result of foolishness. It's a result of ignorance. It's a result of sloppy, bad operating principles. And if a lot of the women who are being abused and are being struck and hit by boyfriends, live-in men, and all kinds of situations, if they would just require that the man who fathers their children also be their husband, a lot of this would be eliminated. A lot of this would be eliminated, especially within the context of a Christian faith community, going to church, being a church-going family. If you and your husband are going to church every Sunday and then you're going to raise your children in a Christian context, you are probably never, ever going to experience any kind of domestic abuse. You're not going to experience a lot of the problems that a lot of these ad campaigns are trying to solve. And that's such a weak solution. And we think this is the solution in our society all the time. We think if we just throw an ad campaign, here's one, break the silence, end the violence. Again, here's that cliche. You've always got to have some little catchy ad that will catch people's attention. And when they're scrolling through on the internet, surfing the web, they'll see something. Oh, break the silence, end the violence. Take a stand against domestic violence. Well, the best thing you can do to take a stand against domestic violence is to marry the father of your children and stay married and commit to that and live the Christian life. There's so many profound things that can be done to stop domestic violence. Now, we have to ask ourselves, when we see a sign like this, where it says, break the silence, end the violence, take a stand against domestic violence. What do they mean, take a stand against domestic violence? That gets to the action. What action do you take when you want to do something about this problem? And what I've been saying all along is we need to look below the surface. See, a lot of these ad campaigns and media blitzes and these organizations and these people who are out passing out little stickers, end the violence, stop the violence, end domestic violence, and all of this activism, it's called. And that's the big thing today, activism. See, without a social moral consensus, without the moral foundations that used to come from Christianity, the church, the Bible, a faith community, without that, you have no spiritual and moral foundation. So what do you do? How do you get people to do the right thing? How do you get people to treat each other with respect and dignity and not lash out in insults and violence and have all kinds of negative social consequences. How do you enforce a sort of pseudo morality if you don't have morality anymore based in God and the Bible and church? Well, you have to do it through social pressure, and that's what these groups are trying to do. They're trying to say, well, we don't need God, we don't need church, you don't need church, you don't need the Bible, you don't need all of those old-fashioned traditional moral ways. We don't need any of that. We can sleep in on Sunday and just goof around on Sundays and treat it like any other day off. And we don't have to read the Bible. That's an old dusty book. It's got a lot of old-fashioned things in it. We've moved beyond that. See, if you have that attitude toward Christianity and you have that very disrespectful attitude toward God and God's will, then you've got to come up with a way to have some kind of a pseudo-moral situation in society, or it'll be complete chaos. And so what people do today is they lean on and try to organize propaganda campaigns. They try to lean on, for example, and this is a prime example, the domestic violence. Stop domestic violence. Instead of speaking and appealing to people's morality and saying, do unto, like Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or love your neighbor as you love yourself, and talk about the teachings of Christ where he talks about the great commandments, the love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And the great famous 1 Corinthians 13 passage where Paul talks about love is patient and kind, and you go all through the list of descriptions of what love is. Instead of appealing to their moral sense, the image of God made in everyone else, they try to bypass all that and say, we don't need all that old-fashioned stuff. What we'll do is we'll just slap an ad campaign. Yeah, that'll do it. We'll just put up posters in the subways and billboards on the highways, and we'll run public service announcements, and we'll get the government funding, and we'll just make this into a big ad campaign, and yeah, that'll really stop the domestic violence. Well, where is that getting you? How is that working out? It's not working out. That's the reality. It's not working out. People are moral beings. They're made in the image of God. We learn that from Genesis, the first few chapters of Genesis. We know that it is also God's will for men and women to marry and have children. Jesus said a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. They shall become one flesh. We know that there is order in a marriage. There is structure in a marriage. There is order in a family. Children have responsibilities. They're to respect their parents. They're to obey their parents. They're to respect their elders, their grandparents, and so forth. And there's an order. There's a beauty there. That is the only way domestic violence will end, when people return to the way God designed things instead of trying to bypass God and solve it on their own human terms. And that's where we're at. We have people trying to bypass God. We need to return to God and return to the wisdom that he gives us. Well, I hope that's been a helpful commentary. We'll see you back next week on the program. God bless.